Welcome to a brand new episode of 10 Lessons Learned. My name is Yi, and I'm joined by a great friend and colleague, Jeffrey Wang. How are you today, Jeff?
Good. How you going, E?
Very good. So today, we continue our experiment with this new format where we dive into the treasure trove of 10 Lessons Learned library, look across all of 120 odd episodes and 1,000 plus lessons to identify standout lessons themes have been shared by our guests. The logic of this format is pretty simple. We've had the pleasure to host our amazing guests. So in today's episode, we're talking about this topic of humility, Jeff. Being humbled or feeling humble is a feeling that we all had before. What does that come to your mind when you hear the word humility?
Well, humility is probably one of those core virtues that I regard as very important, especially coming from an Asian background. Humility is very much a part of our upbringing. This is lessons that keeps coming up again and again as we talk to different guests in 10 lessons. Now, I probably want to draw attention to the lesson by Megumi Miki. So Megumi says in her episode, lesson number 8, we're not even a speck of dust in the grand scheme of things. Keep humble, keep curious, keep learning, not take ourselves too seriously. And I guess I like that because what she's talking about is that when you have that benefit of perspective, having that humility, you realize you're not the center of the universe. It does put you in a better mindset to not worry about things that you can't control. And I also just want to draw on the lesson from Brad Chen, lesson number 6. It's very simple, be humble. I noticed because of our cultural upbringing, and as you may know, because of our culture, a lot of us grow up with humility as something that we're just expected to do and we take for granted. But we do, because we straddle different cultures, we spend a lot of time in the West, we do find it very challenging to stay humble while being able to be confident and achieve the kind of success that we want while remaining true to our humility. It is an interesting lesson, but at the same time, not without its challenges because we operate in these complex world of a multicultural society. We have to straddle that fine line between being humble.
Yeah. It's not an easy balance to achieve that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly resonate, Megumi's lesson. Porche's lesson was great as well. He talked about not being ego-driven, having the foresight and intelligence. I think in the business context, I think that's what our audience really cares about. Brett has given us a great insight. What he defines as humility is that it's about running companies that last beyond the current leadership.
Yeah. Well, he did refer to a book by Jim Collins, Good to Great. He spoke about this concept of level 5 leadership. And level 5 leadership is a brand of leadership that's characterized by a unique blend of personal humility and professional will. So it's kind of like a pinnacle of leadership effectiveness, which drives organization, as you refer to succeed beyond the tenure of the leader, right? So it's one of those organizations that, after they succeed, the people would say that we did it ourselves, not realizing it was the leader that ultimately created the conditions for that organization to flourish. But I also want to draw on the fact that there may be some truth or universalism in terms of this style of leadership, because clearly Jim Collins is not from an Asian world. And I like to think that humility has that it's a universal virtue across different cultures. It may be that certain cultures are much more expressive and they've forgotten to emphasize the importance of that humility, but it is something that I believe is still a key ingredient to succeed no matter which culture you're operating in.
Absolutely. I think it's always a balance that you're trying to achieve. If I were to draw on some personal experience on this, a lot of this concept of being humble is built into our brain from very early days by our parents and the social setting that we operate in. But I think sometimes people really need to distinguish the difference between humility as a value trait versus a behavioral trait where, a lot of the people from the Asian background, for example, or just naturally being introverted, these people, actively choose things like avoid talking in a large crowd, avoid the spotlight and being deliberately low key. To me, those are actually behavioral traits. When you actually do those things, doesn't mean that you're being humble. But a lot of people think they are being humble when they do those things. I think that distinction between a value trait and behavioral trait to me is my personal reflection is that for me, those behaviors may be my default setting. That's naturally how I feel I need to do or I would do. But certainly in a lot of circumstances, particularly in a professional, workplace environment, you need to be deliberately out there. You need to make sure your voice is heard. So just defaulting back to those behavioral traits may not necessarily be the right strategy because, different circumstances in workplace, it really demands you to do different things, I suppose.
All you're referring to is that the Asian culture tend to be rather passive. We tend to trying to dissolve to the background, trying to not rock the boat, cause too much conflict or draw attention to ourselves. Interestingly, Hector Colon, as
Mm.
another guest, has also explored in his lesson, which is more the downside of humility. I think he says lesson number 2, he said humility at its core is about serving others. What he actually said, which I thought was quite interesting, is that sometimes humility is seen as not being confident or lacking ambition, which is what you're speaking about in terms of how a person from an Asian culture avoids a spotlight, avoids speaking up. What's interesting is around the mindset of why they do it. A lot of us don't want to rock the boat because we don't want to put ourselves in the firing line. That's actually a selfish motivation and not necessarily motivated the right way. What has to be done in order for something to succeed? Sometimes you will force yourself. A true leader will overcome that discomfort or that risk to oneself and say what needs to be said. I think once you're motivated the right way, and that's what Hector was trying to get at, a humble leader will do what is required, not what is comfortable. And sometimes that means speaking up. And in fact, that reminds me of a good C.S. Lewis quote. Humility is not thinking less of
Yeah.
yourself, it's thinking of yourself less.
Yeah.
And I think there's some truth to that.
You talk about motivation. A lot of times it is not always about achieving something or getting something. It is also about self-preservation. I certainly feel that is the case where, particularly people coming from, less fortunate background, that scarcity mindset is always there. So again, different circumstances really demands different approach, I suppose. Hector's lesson, the one you brought up, also had a really important message. It is that I think it really rings true across some of the lessons that were just mentioned earlier. Is
Mhm.
that humility in a business setting is it's about being a servant leader. If you are a leader, really are in the service of others and the team. That itself is really resonating with me, at least, where you practice humility as a leader at work. These are the things you really need to do, like being able to recognize diverse opinions and giving those opportunities for people to voice different opinions, different perspectives, willing to change your mind when you're being presented with new data, new evidence or argument that suggests your initial belief, for example,
Mm.
and really trying to understand before being understood. I think those things are really important as a leader at workplace. And that's all underpinned by this virtue that is humility.
Indeed. When you talk about servant leadership, Brad also covers that as well, in that he believes that the ultimate form of leadership is what you describe as servant leadership. Another one of our guests that drew on servant leadership is Sheriff Paul Penzone. Spoke about what servant leadership is. And the interesting point that he made about servant leadership, it doesn't mean being passive or pushover, and a lot of times when you talk
Yeah.
about humility, it doesn't mean that you're biting your tongue. And in fact, a servant leader means being honest even when someone has fallen short, when they haven't lived up to their potential. We need to be compassionate at the same time as being candid and
Mm.
truthful. You tell them what they need to know rather than what they want to hear. Being humble means that we understand that other people will have challenges and shortcomings, and we don't judge them or we don't hold that against them. But at the same time, we need to be truthful and honest in how we communicate that to them. And that's all part of being a humble servant leader.
I think humility, if I want to add maybe one last thing, Jeff, humility to me at the end of the day really is situation based. The behavior that we exhibit or we choose to do really needs to be cognizant of the situation that we are in, because in many ways you can practice humility that is different from what you would default to do as a person. It doesn't invalidate the fact that you are a humble person and open-minded, giving other people an opportunity to speak. There are situations where you will have to be really firm. You have to make sure that your voice is voiced and your opinions heard. So to me, a lot of it is really about being situational aware, and then being strategic and being selective in your response. That to me is the biggest reflection from my perspective.
Yeah, being humble means that you accept the possibility that you could always be wrong. If we go into life with that openness, then you're opening yourself to wisdom, right? You're opening yourself to new information. I guess there's another concept that I want to cover here in terms of humility. I think Dr. Andrew Browning, who was the missionary, spoke about becoming a servant leader. What he say is lesson number 7: lead by coming last, by being a servant. Right?
So,
There is the element of understanding. So humility allows us to understand that we don't necessarily deserve what we get. In fact, Jack Milligan also spoke about this. We need to stay humble and maintain a servant mentality and remember to say thank you. I mean, at the end of it, it means that we have to have gratitude. Humility reminds us to have gratitude for things that we have. And ultimately, that is, I know it's a bit counterintuitive because, humility makes us understand where we are in the world. And this kind of relates back to Megumi's point. But our insignificance actually does not make us depressed. In fact, it makes us grateful. It speaks to something much deeper in us. Having that worldview will allow us to be happy, and so it goes on to that age old, what's the secret of happiness? It's gratitude. It's about focusing on all the good things, and being humble allows us to do that, because the opposite of humble is thinking that you deserve everything. And when you don't get it, you're not going to be very happy. But being thankful for everything that you got given, that is certainly a way to be appreciative of what you have.
yeah, no, look, it's been a great conversation, Jeff. As always, when we chat, this is sort of the deep meaning and the insightful knowledge that I get from our conversation. This is certainly no difference. So I think we can finish off here. That's the end of this short episode on the topic of humility. I hope everyone who's listening to this enjoyed our conversation, and certainly keen to hear your perspective on this great topic, and share that with us whenever you enjoy this podcast on all the social platforms. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.